Where do you think it is for Australians at the moment?
The average Australian would be very, very skeptical of the idea. Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't feel war. I just own halfway to Siwa.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
Andy, how you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. What have you been up to this week?
It's been an interesting week for me. Very busy, but I went to... Have you ever used one of those infrared saunas?
No, but I have been in some weird pod that did something, but I can't remember what it was meant to do.
Intriguing.
I'm just trying to remember what it was, though. It was, I think it was some massage pod. It's like you lay in it like a waterbed or something, and then like it just did all this weird stuff around you. I can't remember. It's been a while.
That sounds interesting. The only pods that I know of are usually associated to corporate environments where they have wellness pods where you can go and take like a nap in or something.
No,
for
wellness pods. Like,
yeah.
That's just, there's nothing worse than seeing like an office designed by an architect who has no idea how people actually work. Like they have all these like collaboration tables and all these like creative spaces for people to, you know, stand up and do a joint presentation and like no one ever uses them.
Who doesn't like a good breakout area? I know it is. And I think I've shared my disdain for these kind of type of workplaces and WeWorks with you a lot. I think the wellness pod seals the deal for me. It's like, surely people will be appetized by this weird kind of cocoon looking thing in the middle of a crowded office. Somehow they will manage to, you know, take a quick cat nap in the middle of their day and feel refreshed when they come out. You know, this is a good use of 50 grand that, you know, that we're paying to kind of buy this pod.
And then it's like some basic things that would actually help people. They don't have like, you know, for example, lockers that you can leave stuff overnight, or a desk that is yours that you can have your things on and your belongings on and not have to pack them up every day.
How about something even more basic than that? How about for officers that still wear suits, I know, dying breed, somewhere to hang your freaking suit so that you don't have to put it on the back of your chair and then feel like weird, like you're crushing it, your expensive suit or whatever it is. Something as basic as that. You know, like I feel like we've got it all wrong. When I started my career, the officers, even though they were uglier, in quotation marks, they were way more functional in the old cubicle area. Sounding like an old man now.
I remember the first workplace I ever worked in, like officers were still pretty dominant. So people, I didn't have an office,
with doors.
Yeah. And I mean, I didn't have an office, so I was in an open plan environment, but it was in relative terms had offices, whereas now like even the most senior people in organizations don't have an office.
Yeah, they're in the wellness pod. I feel the same way. So I started my career in an environment which was, do you remember Dilbert, the comic?
Yeah.
So I was in an old school cubicle farm. So you looked across the floor and it was just one kind of like massive hamster cage style cubicles, right? As far as the eye could see. And if you stood up, you could see past your partition and through the whole floor from end to end. So you could stick up like a meerkat and like see across the thing. And it sounds oppressive and nasty and more like battery hens, but it was actually really good because everyone had their own space. And inside your cubicle, it was like your own office. You had a wardrobe thing where you could put your suit. You had like heaps of, you know, a 360-degree desk. It was great. I really liked it.
Yeah, I had something very similar in my last job, and it did feel quite a private space. And I think it just gives you a bit of a barrier, like a sense of like, or even just being able to have like your own things like out. Like,
I think people forget about that, right? Like this idea that you can all hot desk and everyone can be talking and it can be noisy. And it's just like people don't work like that.
The other thing too, like I'm always skeptical of someone who just works from a laptop. So I'm not sure if that's you, but because like I need multiple screens, I need my desk set up in like a certain way.
Yeah.
Like I'm like a performance athlete when I'm like at
Your
my desk.
ergonomics.
Like, I need my gear. It needs to be set up perfectly.
I mean, you don't have one. You're not one of those people who have the keyboards that split in the middle.
No, I don't have one of those. But my quirky keyboard story is that when I changed jobs, the type of keyboard that my new employer gave me was obviously different, different brand or whatever. So I went to eBay and sourced my own private supply of keyboards that were identical to the one I was using in my old job.
They're on
And
back order or something from like the 90s.
yeah, from eBay. And I didn't just buy one, I bought a supply of them.
Oh, amazing. I work in a tech environment from time to time, and have you heard of mechanical keyboards?
No.
So there's this real subculture around mechanical keyboards, right? So modern keyboards, when you touch them, there's not really like the sensors aren't mechanical. And so, the old ones, when you touch them, it has actual feedback. It's not haptics or anything modern like that. It has feedback as the switch punches down the key, and it has this really satisfying click. And there's all these different types of keyboards that have hard and soft clicks. So back in the day when you're typing, it was like very clacky. And so there are people who have these kind of followings for the different types, and there's blue caps, red caps, and there's this whole world about it. And I went down that rabbit hole a little bit because a lot of my colleagues were using it, and they were like, once you try it, you can't go back. It's amazing. Like if you ever used a mechanical keyboard with a really nice kind of click and feel, it's just a different experience. It's actually almost like a pleasurable touch typing experience. Like back when you first learned how to touch type and you could pick up speed and you could almost keep up with your thoughts. It's like that, but with a more kind of visceral, kind of physical experience. I'm going to get you one for your next Christmas present.
So, Roger, what are we talking about today?
So, Andy, a couple of months ago, we had our conversation on race and racism. It was one of our most popular episodes, and we had feedback from our listeners. And what kind of went on from that feedback was some recommendations to look at books that reframe racism and also the topic of white privilege. And alongside that, maybe what would be referred to as white fragility. So today, I think we were planning to have a chat about white privilege as a bit of a continuation of the race discussion and how kind of our learning, our perspectives have evolved from our original chat that we didn't really read any extra source material for. We didn't prepare in an academic way for that conversation. It was a genuine, real conversation. And today we wanted to, continue that.
Also, I think we are today going to drill down on a very specific aspect of this sort of general library of topics to do with racism, the concept of white privilege. So I think we actually had no plans to do this episode, but we thought, we actually just out of curiosity started reading a couple of books again.
So I think you're right. Like we didn't have a lot of preparation for that. So, but for me, I actually love the innocence of that conversation, right? Because we didn't go into it with, armed with talking points to say, this is how I'm going to kind of lean on you to prove my point or to be one side. It was actually a real conversation, and it's the beginning of a conversation done in a way between friends, right?
Thinking back to that conversation, we didn't have like a clear framework maybe to present all the different thoughts and concepts together.
So Andy, today we're focusing in on the topic of white privilege. How would you describe the definition of white privilege and how it's kind of linked into this language around racism and things like that?
So white privilege, like a really superficial read of it, is that if you're white, you have privilege. But I think it is a bit deeper than that. I think reflecting on the fact that people who are white generally, and it is sort of like inarguable really, have in our society like positions of power. They dominate institutions of, at senior positions. They have control over political spheres. And so white privilege is not to say that there's some cunning sort of group of people in the boardroom,
Illuminati,
disseminating all of the spoils of their race. It's not actually about that you're actually white in terms of the way that maybe a more sort of simple notion of race might kind of traditionally define it. It's actually more about culture and groups of people and the dominant society, and certainly countries like the one we live in, but also where these sort of race issues get discussed in the context of, say, America, the UK, or Canada or New Zealand, where really there is this white majority, but not just that they're a majority of the population, but that they are a majority in all of the key institutions of power.
Yeah. So it's, like you said, less about just the pigmentation, but more about your in-group status being in a dominant cultural kind of force.
I mean, the concept of white privilege is really just to push back on this idea that like we've solved like race problems, like that there's no more racism. So let's say in the United States, in its history, it's had many periods of very overt categorical segregation and things like that. And maybe some of those things have ended. And so one view might be, oh, we've solved the racism problem, right? There's the Ku Klux Klan it's had its worst membership year in history, and most people are we've had a black president, and so really there's no race issues in America anymore. And I think white privilege is actually a bit of a pushback to that in some ways, by saying no. Some of those overt forms of racism maybe have dissipated, evolved, changed, gone away, become less severe, whatever. But that does not mean you've gotten rid of all of the ways in which white people, as part of the dominant group, but not just dominant in numbers or anything like that, but dominant in terms of their hold on institutions, some of the ways in which that still delivers ongoing and current advantages to white people that aren't enjoyed by people of other races, or who look different, or who aren't perceived to be part of that white culture or that white group.
Yeah. So just to kind of push it into a bit more of a digestible view, so you can type in something like examples of white privilege into Google, and the kind of things that you get are common everyday things that you might get is that you take for granted that you might learn about your culture at school, kind of thing, or that the majority of your teachers are your own race, and the kind of treatment that you get from that is not conscious, but the fact that people relate more to similar people in the way that they look and so on. You can go to a music store and find artists that look like you. So all these things that probably aren't on the surface, but that you just don't even have to think about because you are part of that dominant group in society and that white privilege.
Yeah, and I think maybe in like a lot of these concepts sort of are more sort of contextualized in, say, the US experience with like particularly African Americans and some of the legacy of past injustices for those people. But maybe in an Australian context, it might be something as simple as growing up in Australia in the 90s and 2000s, and as a kid, like the most popular show being something like Home and Away or Neighbours, and watching a show like that and having an all-white cast and not seeing yourself in that world and not seeing people like yourself on TV. And I guess the flip side of that being that, your friends at school not having an insight into your world and what your world is like.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the term white privilege is already quite divisive, right? Because it's kind of pushing this undertone of as someone as part of that group, as a white person, perhaps the advantages that you've gained by being part of that group means that your achievements maybe aren't fully earned on your own back. There's this kind of tailwind that's pushing you along. So Andy, we talked about the fact that we both read a few books this week on reference. Do you want to kind of tell listeners what they are?
So Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge, which I think was a recommendation from one of our listeners. And the other book that we read is called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So 2 books which are really quite clear on the notion of white privilege. They delve into these concepts. Yeah, so I mean, I guess for me, I must say, like, especially kind of reflecting on our race episode, I must admit, like, there were some like eerie kind of echoes of, oh yeah, I just did the thing that they're talking about in this book when I reflected on the episode. So that was kind of interesting, like seeing some of myself in it, and it in some ways made me kind of listen with a little bit more intent, because said, oh, I just said that in a podcast like a couple of months ago, so but yeah, I mean, I guess a little bit different books, like not quite the same in terms of focus, but maybe different angles on the same thing, which is essentially, some of the more nuanced areas of where people of color or from different backgrounds are continuing to experience forms of racism in their lives today.
Yeah, I agree. And like I said at the start of this episode, it was a whole different language, right? It was almost like being exposed to being a university and taking a course on liberal studies or something. And what struck me is that when we had this conversation as friends, we kind of came to it at a place of good faith. But listening even to the intro of the Rennie book, I just thought to myself, oh, like we're already on the front foot, right? We're like being provocative, we're challenging the reader, challenging kind of their whiteness and how they should feel and calling them out on their behavior in a lot of ways, right? How did you feel listening to that book? Did it make you kind of angry, or did it put you in a defensive frame immediately?
The content of these books fundamentally did not present new ideas to me. What in that I kind of know about the general ideas and concepts of the things that they've talked about. However, I think probably, if I'm honest, like when I've been exposed to these ideas in the past, I don't think they've been presented to me like the best possible like form of argument. So I've heard these ideas like often criticized, for example, where people have their takedowns of like, oh, here are these different, wild, crazy ideas, right? And perhaps some bad faith takes of some of these ideas. And so it was good to like actually read these books and these ideas myself to judge for myself. But maybe to answer your question more specifically, like maybe particularly as a white person, both books are kind of framed fairly antagonistically.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Did you feel that when you read it?
Well, of course, your starting point is that maybe you're waiting to hear what's the story, like what's so bad about white people. That's got to be the start. So look, I think the central messaging here is quite challenging, because it essentially says that you have this kind of original sin, right? Your whiteness, or you being part of white culture, or whatever, however you want to frame it. There's like some original sin associated with it that you can't avoid and that you have no matter what. And the framing of it, if you don't engage in the ideas themselves, the framing of it can open that perception very quickly.
I did feel that coming off the page, and I must say, especially in the Rennie book, right? Like it's very much antagonistic, and there is a little bit of in the way it's delivered as well. And that was a bit of a hard ride for me in the beginning, because I could see that. I was like, wow, this is coming out swinging. And is it the right way to get people on side to have a discussion?
Your starting point is that you're under attack, and so your immediate reaction is to get into some sort of on the front foot, and you get on the attack because you've got to fight for your own self-worth almost. Whereas I think when you actually read the ideas, like, so to start with, like both titles of both books are like absolutely like have been picked by marketers, right? They've absolutely been picked to attract a degree of heat and controversy, probably to sell books, no surprises, right? But when you actually read the ideas, they're actually not as antagonistic, because they sort of do have a certain logic to them that you can follow.
When it comes to the chat we had around racism and so on, I think when you hear white privilege, it's even more vague, right? Because you kind of then go, all right, you're talking about privilege here, but is it just my like racial privilege? What about all the other things, that impact me, like the amount of money I have, my class, my background, and all this kind of stuff? So I do think that it is a hard term to pick up, and it's not immediately clear what the term is trying to achieve in some ways, right? Is it just an acknowledgement that you're part of a dominant group in society, or is it something deeper?
All right, so just to unpack that a little bit more, so the concept of like white privilege, right? What is the definition of white then? Like, what are we actually talking about when we say white privilege?
Yeah, so look, from my point of view, it's being able to kind of be recognized and accepted by a dominant group of culture that largely has, Eurocentric, Anglo-centric kind of features, right? So I think that if you can pass as those cultures and you have those characteristics, you can be accepted by that group and therefore benefit from some of the structural advantages of that.
People who are like cynical or skeptical of this stuff, they would say, well, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean advantages? Like, we have equal opportunity kind of policies, employment policies. We don't have, racial discriminations taken very seriously. Racist abuse isn't tolerated anymore. So talk to me a little bit about when we talk about like structural advantages, what are the kinds of things that we're talking about?
Okay, you can look at it in a couple of different ways, but if I kind of look at, all right, structural advantages, you can even just look at things like representation of white people in positions of power. Like that's a huge bit that's overwhelming. So just to rattle off a few, Congress, I'll take a US-centric view because the stats are really strong. Congress, 90% white. Governors, 96% white. Military advisors, 100% white. People who decide the TV shows and executives, 93% white. Books, 90% white. Decisions around music production, 90% white. Teachers, 83% white. College professors, 84% white. Owners of football teams, 97% white. So you'd step back and you'd kind of say, all right, there are mechanisms that are advantaging the ascension of white individuals in society into positions of power, right? So that's very structural. So that's one. But you could take that stats and move that into healthcare, prison and reforms, wealth as well.
But just to take some of those figures, right? Now I think they're from America, right? So
they're US-based ones.
They're US-based, but like I think just for argument's sake, like I think you could probably pick any sort of equivalent stat for Australia or for the UK or whatever, and you get something broadly similar, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things. So the first is when you look at data like that, the first question is, in terms of why that's a problem, is the data itself reflective of those kind of structural advantages for white people, or is it that there's such domination of these very powerful organizations or whatever by a certain narrow group of people, such that the decisions that they make aren't, as leaders and as people with power, aren't going to be inclusive and recognize the needs of other people or the various experiences of other people. So to that first part, so is the fact that you have 95% white people in, let's say in Parliament here in Australia, right? I don't know what the percentage would be, but it would be very high.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of a white privilege sort of story? And for me, that's not so clear in the sense that I don't think we know yet, because we have a lot of legacy issues. I mean, we had a White Australia policy, really. So there's a lot of historical legacies. I mean, obviously, we have increasing immigration into Australia over the past several decades. So Australia looks very different to what it looks like now. So when you look at Parliament House and the typical person in Parliament House, it can be as much that, well, actually the lack of diversity is just that, 70% of parliamentarians have, a law degree from a Sandstone University. And that's where the lack of diversity actually sits. And the lack of diversity in Parliament reflects the lack of diversity in terms of, people with a law degree from Sandstone University itself, right? And then you look at all of the barriers and reasons why, but then over time, hopefully that would change. And hopefully if now, for example, there's better representations in terms of people who are studying law at a Sandstone University, for example, or whatever the other channels that people get into political parties, that some of those imbalances may start to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree that you obviously need to have the right kind of applicants and right people, and that needs to be representative, right, further back in the pipeline. But I think it leads to a similar conclusion, though, right, that there are barriers for people representing in those pipelines, right? It's the same thing that affects it. And I'm a little bit more skeptical because I think that the incumbents at the top want to, I suppose, hold on to their power, right?
I mean, it can be that the reason there's fewer people in the pipeline is because, let's say, they're new migrants, perhaps being of lower socioeconomic status, if let's say they've come to Australia with nothing, that it can be that that's been the barrier for them to then pursue the higher education, whatever. It could be a language barrier, it could be so many other factors. So that will resolve themselves in time. For example, second generation may not have those disadvantages, but there's no single, like, when you say the incumbents make a decision, like there isn't, it's a system, it's an institution. It's not like an individual decision maker deciding, oh, well, we don't want people of this, this background in our world, so let's have all of these requirements. Like there's this, like, so what you've
I think
got
that's
to,
very naive, because like look at the board CEO and board memberships around and their kind of old boy status, right? There's obviously a preferential treatment that goes into that, and that's not a big leap for me in terms of human behavior, that in groups form and they like to look after their own.
So in groups form, but in terms of, is there like a conscious, deliberate attempt to exclude people? Like in some ways, that's the easy bit to deal with. Like if you see the conscious stuff happening, if you see like conscious policies to, like you see the actual overt racism that happens, in some ways that's the easy part to deal with because you can see it. It's so obvious and it's so apparent. But the challenge with what you've talked about, like say in group and kind of just, oh, we play golf on the weekend, so we'll get people who we're friends with, and that's how we get to know each other, and then we get to trust them more or whatever. That's actually, a lot of that's like unconscious, and they might actually, like, the biggest danger is that people in those positions actually don't see themselves as having like there being a race impact or racial impact to how they make decisions. But it's the fact that it's unconscious and that it's not happening deliberately that actually makes it more pernicious.
I think we just touched on a really good kind of point. I'm not saying that there's some evil white club at the head of organizations that have pictures on the wall and, like, no packies or anything like that, right? I think that, like you said, it's an unconscious bias a lot of the times, and a lot of it is human nature around these in-groups, right? Like you said, they're friends, they have roots in the community, they know their families and their kids, they're more willing to give it to jobs where they have relationships with people. But that all leads to the same point, that why I don't believe it's just going to flush out with a new pipeline of applicants.
If you're talking about something like being a member of parliament, a very big barrier for someone of a different background is that you've got to convince your fellow citizens to vote for you. And so really what we're talking about in that context is, whether at, like I say, a pre-selection level within a political party, or we're talking about like they do get pre-selected and then they go to a vote, whether the public elects them, there might be barriers there, and I'm sure there would be. But whenever you look at these situations, it's like it's a multivariate situation. There's lots of different factors contributing to the situation we have, and some of them would be race and have like interactions with race and racial prejudice and all the rest of it. But some of them would be just that, well, this population controlling for this factor, they don't tend to have as many of these other things that you need to get into these other positions. So I'm not denying and challenging that race has any impact, and that there isn't white privilege, but just that it's not all white privilege.
Yeah. Okay. So I think for me too, like from our previous conversation, we focus more in on kind of racist acts, right, of discrimination, and I think something like white privilege goes that next level to say that there are lots of unconscious biases that are happening all over the place. All these little things help the people of that group as a bit of a tailwind, right? So Andy, when you first heard that word white privilege, like for someone obviously who's white, first of all, how like personal do you take it when you hear that word?
It's a little bit like if I said to you, you've got like male privilege, right? Or, whatever characteristic that you have that you could sort of be perceived as having an advantage, right? Saying that you have privilege. So it could be, oh, you've got like native English speaker privilege, or you've got male privilege. So, and that all of your advantages come from whatever that thing is, right? So, and I think people from private schools probably feel the same way, right? It's like, oh, you got private school privilege. So I do think the framing of it sets you back a little bit, but it's hard to think, well, what's the alternative way of putting it? And I do think when people talk about like white privilege, especially like in the books that we read, so white fragility and so on, they don't talk about whiteness as being like, as we talked about, like the color of your skin or anything like that. But it's actually like the culture, so, and the dominant culture and the social construct of race. So I do wonder is it the right way to present the concept? Because I think if you present to people a more generic concept of privilege that that isn't quite so loaded, I think you might engage people, especially like if part of the premise of this challenge of white privilege is that, well, it's very hard, if you're not in the position of power to change the world, right? So one of the key ways to change the world with respect to some of these issues is to, have that conversation be, amongst a whole community, not just those that, are really passionate about the cause.
Yeah. I mean, like, this is the middle, right? And I think the reason why it's such a tricky conversation is because people take it personal, right? Like, so for a minute, let's step back from you and I and previous conversations and so on, right? And let's try to find like the edges, right? So like 100% I've met people who don't believe in white privilege at all, right? Total meritocracy. I'm an individual. You don't know me, so don't even try to kind of cast any judgment on who I am and what I have in this life, right? You don't know me. And then there are people way on the other side that will kind of say, look, I acknowledge it. It's gotten me, it's given me immeasurable benefits in my life, and I need to kind of acknowledge, almost feel sorry for it at each kind of step. Yeah. Where do you think the middle is for Australians at the moment?
I think most people, the average Australian, would be very, very skeptical of the idea. So the average Australian. But the average Australian hasn't engaged with the ideas in any meaningful, deep way. They would just see it very superficially. They don't see it for like a broader conversation about advantages and privileges. I mean, this is really about the subtle ways that people benefit. This isn't about you were born with the golden spoon in your hand because you were white and you were given all of the riches and this isn't about that. It's actually about saying that at the margin, all other things being equal, you have a bit of a leg up. So I think when people hear it, I think they kind of see it as a bit of a cop-out, a bit of an explanation for, oh, well, you didn't work hard enough and now you're just trying to blame it on something else, right? And that's how I think that like the average or typical Australian might treat these ideas. But it can be kind of synthesized into a more generic conversation about privilege. And I think if you sort of maybe talk to people about it in less antagonistic terms and start to say things like, well, do you think someone who went to a private school has advantages in their life? Most Australians would probably say, yeah, they probably do. And in some ways, there's a little bit of grey areas and sort of overlap with some of those kind of ideas. And I think that's where I think you could engage the typical Australian.
Yeah, I think it's quite, and I totally agree. I actually think that most people don't see it like in terms of that. Like, I remember in our original race conversation, I asked you the simple question, do you see it as a privilege that you went through life not even thinking about your race and not experiencing any kind of discrimination purely on your race, right? Like, that's the lens that I was asking you that question, right? But I think that for most people, most Australians rather, they would really struggle with attributing any of their successes to their whiteness, to the fact that, because they don't see their race, right? Which is one of the key themes of some of the books we read, is that you mentioned that previously, that you've never really identified as like white, right? Like, it's not you haven't thought about it in that way.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, I definitely don't think of myself as white. But the funny thing is the books talk about, oh, well, that's what white people say. But I think.
You're so basic. Sorry to interrupt the podcast. Andy and I have really enjoyed doing this, and while we don't want your money or anything like that, it's been great to see the number of our listeners grow since we kicked things off last year.
The best way for us to reach more people is word of mouth. So if you'd like to support us, then we'd be really grateful if you could share it to a friend or someone that you think might enjoy the podcast.
We know there's a conversation for everyone, so please pick an episode that you think that they'd like and share away.
That ends our shameless plug, and we'll return you now back to the episode. I'll give my biggest criticism of this idea of white privilege is that it would just be so much better to cut the crap and just talk about it without all the loaded terms, right? Talk about it without all the loaded baggage. When we're talking about like white people, I would be in that category, right? So if you ask me, what advantages did I have from being white? I would say most of the actual concrete advantages are actually not directly first order to do with my race. They're actually to do with things like where I grew up, which school I went to, which social groups I connected in with, and none of those are directly first order connected to race. Their race might have some influence or some second, third, fourth, fifth order effect on the probability that I would engage or experience my life the way I did. But it's very hard and it's very subtle. So for me, it would be much more, if we're talking about like how do we solve these problems, much more effective to talk about white privilege in the more generic way, right? So what are the things that you encountered in your life which basically gave you a leg up, that were endowments to you, things you didn't earn, they were just things given to you and you're born with them. And that could be social, it could be economic, it could be a whole raft of things. And then you can work through those and, you know, keep it a bit less charged and a bit more, you know, practical, I guess.
Look, I agree about coming in too hot in terms of if your goal is to provide awareness to enact change. And I think that's the part that I struggle to when reading some of this material, that it's kind of, okay, like acknowledgement is definitely part of the problem, like the start, and then you fix it. But that transition to like why we're doing it and what exactly we want in terms of change is always a little bit of a sleight of hand for me. And I think, you know, I want to talk about solutions soon and how we think about those. But I would say to your example, most of it's proposed that, you know, for say white people to kind of form a bit of a multi-factor analysis to say, where's my advantage come from and where can that be great for, or anyone rather, like, you know, what is the point of that, right? Because they're really saying that one of the tenets of this discussion is that, you know, only white people can kind of enact that combination of prejudice, whether conscious or unconscious, plus systemic power to form racism and privilege, right? That's one of the central tenets of this. And you know, there's that great example in the book where, you know, you got that there's a lady serving kind of traditional African fare, and she saves all the good cuts for her black customers. And it's like, okay, that shop owner is obviously discriminating against white people, but because, you know, her power extends to fucking up some white lady's lunch, it's not really racism, right? Because there's no power behind that prejudice.
One of the themes of the books that we read was that, you know, this idea of, you know, a common white person's response is to say, oh, well, let's talk about everything else, that all the other sources of disadvantage, and let's not talk about race. So I've just kind of basically laid that out. And I'm trying to talk about this as just in an analytical sense, right? The two reasons is, I think, strategically, it's better to do that. Firstly, we've talked about, you'll engage people better. You'll have people engage and buy into the concepts more easily than if you're just seen as like some lunatic, like fringe kind of wokester that's like, you know, an extremist or whatever. Because that's like, let's be honest, like that's like, for better or worse, and I'm not saying that they should be, but that's how they are perceived by a lot of people. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because if you are talking about solutions, and we can get to this later, but why would you not want to leverage a broader conversation about some of these issues around advantage and disadvantage to resolve other forms of prejudice and unconscious bias? So, for example, why wouldn't we use this as a basis to, you know, look at things like opportunities for women? Why wouldn't we use this to look at, you know, people with a disability and make it a much broader conversation? Like, but I think, and maybe just to sort of loop back to, you know, why that's kind of not satisfying for many people. It's just not kind of hitting the spot, right? So I feel like when people want to talk about and raise these issues to do with race, like part of what I think is being kind of sought and solicited, particularly from white people and particularly from like the incumbent majority, is acknowledgement. And it's a bit like, you know, like part of like the reconciliation sort of piece is like, well, you can't really connect on these issues if there isn't acknowledgement. So I feel like a big part of the language and the approach, it's to get that kind of like to admit, yes, this is a problem.
Yeah, it's like Kanye said, admitting is the first step, right? I think that is a big part of it, right? Like there is that hurt there, and you want to be, when you go through something traumatic, right? You want that validated. You want, when I'm telling that to you about a story about discrimination for me or someone I know or a loved one, I don't want that minimized. I want that acknowledged, right? You know, and I think the problem is, like you said, that acknowledgement doesn't have to implicate you as a horrible individual and assassinate your character. But unfortunately, some of the language, when you come out swinging, it does that, right? It doesn't kind of provide that environment for saying that, because a lot of times that's where you need to start. You need to build that trust and acknowledgement first before you go anywhere. And I think that's why, and because there's resistance against that, so much of these books are dedicated to just getting the reader to go, oh yeah, baby did a bad thing, right? Like, and like get them there first before, and Too Little Time is then directed to, okay, now that you admit it, not that anyone changes their mind really, what do we do about it, right? And like that's the part that I'm kind of interested in, because that's like sand falling through your fingers sometimes, right? It's not, you know, these books spend 95% of it trying to elicit a response to say, come on, admit it, be honest with yourself, you fucked up, you're wrong, right? And then 5% of the book on where should we go next, right? Like, and I think that's the part that's really hard.
I think the words you use there, you fucked up, I think that's the bit that gets, like, that kind of notion is what draws a reaction. You can have privilege without having done anything bad to have received it. So, like, if I said to you, for example, well, you've got male privilege, you fucked up. Like, how do you feel about that?
If my male privilege cause like pain and damage to someone else, then that absolutely might be the right thing to do. Sorry, like if you
but well, just by virtue of you being born male, you didn't do anything wrong, right?
Look, if you're part of a system that kind of benefits,
so you can, right? So there's a difference between acknowledging your privilege and that something needs to be done to remedy and fix the situation and the circumstances faced by, you know, in this case, like women. But I think the sort of the demanding, like, now I don't. By the way, I don't think these books are saying you fucked up, you know, apologize. Like, but just to draw this little bit out, like, that you have an advantage as a man in various ways, you don't owe an apology associated for that. Like, you haven't actually done anything wrong. It's just that by circumstances out of your control, you've been the beneficiary of an unearned or an unearned benefit, I guess.
I think it's trickier than that, right? Like, if we take an example of, say, you know, again, remove us from the situation, right? If you are born a man, and that means, say, like, you're operating in like a Sharia law context or whatever, and it means that you're entitled to certain things compared to a woman, that ultimately means they, you know, get freaking stoned if they commit adultery or whatever it is, right? Like, I think you supporting that and experiencing the benefits, maybe you did fuck up, right? Like, and there's no fault.
How did you fuck
because
up?
Because you're part of a system, but you're part of that system.
Well, you benefit from the system, but you didn't create the system.
Well, I think that's a cop-out.
How?
What do you mean how? Because you're being a part of that system.
What if you don't agree with the system?
What are you doing to advocate change then? In the system?
Well, maybe you are advocating change. This is the thing, right? It's this original sin concept, right?
I think you're getting stuck on a word here. When I said that, like, you know, admit it, you fucked up, it's like you're thinking about the situation, right? Like you got things wrong in that respect. You're kind of moving it from the kind of unconscious elements to the conscious, right? And by going through this journey, you are pushing that dial a bit more into the conscious, because the more and more you're aware of it, the more and more you're complicit in some of the damage that the system does.
But when you said, oh, I fucked up, like, the reason I picked that up is because I said, well, that's the sentiment that people respond to. And then, you know, if there's a sense of you've got to own up to some sort of something you've done or some wrongdoing, that's when you're going to lose people. Did I have things in my life that have helped me that I didn't earn? Absolutely, yes. But do I have original sin because of my race? No. If
you're part of a system that harms other people and they're actually telling you the impact it's had on their lives, like, I think there's an acknowledgement that can be placed there. Like, that's...
Yeah, but acknowledging is quite different to, like, taking the burdens and feeling the burdens of responsibility of it. Like, and I think that's...
But you also just said that, like, white people are needed to change these outcomes, right? So it is, you can't have a system where it's like they need you to change it, but then you're not really responsible for the fact that they have those outcomes against them.
I mean, it's akin to saying someone who was born into a rich family should feel, some sort of deep sorrow and that they were born rich, right? With all of this, born into
Depends
great
how
wealth, right?
Well, it depends how they got that wealth. If they got off the back of exploiting other people and races, then yeah, maybe they should. That's what maybe this is a good time to bring in reparations. That is like literally us paying as taxpayers for atrocities and damage to the Indigenous people of Australia. That's going on now, and we, you and I are paying for that regardless as citizens, regardless of our direct connection to it. Isn't that exactly what we're talking about here?
No, not really, because that's not us internalizing the guilt of what happened.
Can you explain that to me?
It's totally internally consistent to say, I totally support reparations, but I bear no guilt, and I internalize no guilt from this because I was not a party to the actions that led to this situation. And I think guilt, we have to consider a little bit more, just to define exactly what we're talking about in terms of guilt or, sorry, or that you're sorry for something. Like, this is like apportioning accountability for something that happened. And you can support fixing and remedying a problem without necessarily feeling that you're the one that's done something wrong, right? I would like all of the advantages that I had as a child growing up.
And there are elements that continue, right?
Well, to the extent that someone's a perpetrator and has done things to bear responsibility, then for sure. But I guess what we're talking about in the context of like unearned privileges and things like that, these are usually things that aren't to do with the actions of the individual. They just happen to be beneficiary.
No, and I think, look, we've jumped on a word when I was actually saying this is one of the things that I struggled with, and we've jumped on kind of that view of like, oh, you fucked up, and I was using that as an example, right? To answer your question, I think that it's not there's an expectation from minority groups that you're going to like self-flagellate or whatever with a cat of nine tails. It's more the acknowledgement, right? Because right now, like you said, the majority of people actually deny that there is any.
And just by the way, I don't think the books that we've read actually demand this. I think what they're going for is a much weaker claim, which is just simply that as a beneficiary, you have to acknowledge firstly that you're a beneficiary, and second of all, then we've got to start to do things to remedy and close the gap or whatever, right? They weren't asking for some sort of symbolic gesture of, kind of internalize the fault and the intrinsic, because this is the disingenuous takedown of these books, right? Like, so if you kind of Google the takedown videos of the Robin DiAngelo White Fragility book, right? They'll attack things like this. They'll attack things like, oh, there's this, you're born with original sin. That's like the words that are used. But she doesn't say that. That's not the idea. The idea isn't that you have something to apologize for, that you've got to atone for. That's not it at all. It's that you just, if you acknowledge what you've got, that
I think the argument is that you're not a bad person. Like, she doesn't put it into morality, and like you said, there's an acknowledgement about your place in it, and you can and again, being part of a system that disadvantages others, you can acknowledge that and feel sorry for that position and that put that person in without taking on board that is an attack on your character.
Yeah, that sort of subtle, because if people think there is this charge of, and I'll use again, this charge of original sin, that's something that's really hard to grapple with, right? And that's something I react to, right? And it's because I think that there's just something about the notion of blame, or whatever word we use, guilt, blame, whatever, for something that you had no autonomy, control, no locus of control over, right? That's a very heavy thing to be talking about too, because we are talking about quite serious things here.
Yeah.
I actually want to take us now to maybe introduce this concept of the good-bad binary, which is something that was presented in the Robin DiAngelo book on white fragility. And this really resonated with me because I think this explains a lot of the different behaviors. So I'll start by introducing the concept of the good bad binary, and then maybe like we can talk about like how that affects sort of the behavior of people when talking about something like white privilege. So the good bad binary is essentially this idea that like the term racism, it's like the worst thing you can be called, right? Or is a racist. It's like the worst possible. Right now, I can't think of a word that, you know, that certainly as a white person, you don't want to be called racist, right? And partly that's because of like a historical connotation of what a racist is, like a Ku Klux Klan sort of member, someone who does, you know, lynching, whatever, right? All that really terrible stuff. And so the term racist is now so loaded. And so, you know, like this idea of like white people kind of doing everything they can, like saying, no, I'm not a racist. Like, I'm not racist at all. Like, I don't see color, and putting up all of these kind of almost disingenuous sort of like pushbacks to kind of like say, no, there's nothing to see here. I'm absolutely nothing about me.
My ledge is clean.
Yeah, absolutely clean, because it's just the worst possible thing to be called. And so she talks about it in that sense. So yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts about that, and how that colors a lot of this sort of conversation in this space.
I think part of the power of that book and why it was a good read was that it shortcutted so many of these nonsense, right? Because it's someone who's dealt with this through diversity training for a whole career. I see that all the time, and I think the line that really got me was, "Oh, Billy's not a racist. He's a really nice guy." And I get that. I've literally heard that many, many times when like someone's tried to bring that up about a colleague or about something. It's like, no, how can he? You know, it's like akin to the kind of argument where it's like someone tells you about someone wronged them in the workplace and like, oh, but he's always been really nice to me. It's like that has anything to do with the situation. Like I really liked it because it's moving away from, it's like that. It's moving into a more nuanced and evolved way of looking at, you know, racism and all this kind of stuff. It's actually not that it is a character flaw, is that there are things behind the surface that are working, right? And I really kind of like that evolution around what it actually means and to the word means and who it includes, right? Because if it's that charge, like you said, you devote all your energy into defending it. You won't hear anything else. And you just be petrified of like trying to get out of that category, right? And you just change your behavior. You'll exhibit things that you don't really believe in to provide distance between that. And that doesn't help anyone. I also really love the quote she said where she's like, most people used to think about racism only like murder. I understand the concept, but someone has to commit it first for it to be real, right? Like, I think that's a really common thing that I've seen too. It's like, oh, Australia is racist. Well, show me the racist act, right? Like, and it's not about that. It's about you can be a good person. It's not about morality. It's about a structural system and your place in it. And it's actually, once you peel that back, where it's not like, you know, only horrible people are racist, you know, like, you can start to have a better conversation about it, right? Like we've been saying this whole episode, take a little bit of the fire out of the conversation, out of the attack, out of the language, and then give people some place to fumble around. And like even this conversation between you and I, right, it's like fumbling a little bit. We're trying to work out how to get our views across. If there was no good faith there, we just wouldn't say it because we'd be worried about how the group would brand us. So I think this is, we talked about solutions. Implementing this mindset is actually really, really going to help, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the irony of the book is that, you know, it's got this good, bad binary. And I think the reason it resonated with me was that it actually kind of offers a solution, which is that let's actually make it acceptable to acknowledge your biases.
I think so too. And in that book, you know, Andy, I think that this is how powerful the racism word is, right? All your attention is put there. But I actually think one of her more kind of charged lines of, you know, a theory was pretty much saying that everyone's prejudice. It's impossible not to discriminate, right? And I think that's the key, right? Like she's kind of saying that is human behavior, and we need to acknowledge that we all come from different backgrounds and socialize differently, and it's impossible not to discriminate and to have prejudices. Right? It's only when the racism word gets thrown on top of that people get turned off.
My mental model for humans is that we're like imperfect probability generating machines. So we, you know, so people who are deciding which, you know, which car salesperson they gravitate to, they're applying like a mental model of well, I want someone who's not going to rip me off, right? And so there's all sorts of different cues that they look to. So they might want to get, someone who looks has a certain appearance, like appearance might factor in. And like you might only have 4 things that stick out, that pop out to you when you see the salesperson in the car yard. And for some people, it might be like a racial cue.
Definitely.
That's kind of unconscious bias, right? That's white privilege, right? So if for some group of people, I'm giving a hypothetical example, if for some people it is, oh no, I want someone who's like me so I can talk to them on my level or whatever, that's white privilege, because that person then gets all the sales, gets all the, so, and there's probably many more salient examples we talked about, like the executives. So, I know this person can steer the room like I would, because they're more similar to me.
Yeah,
that's
doesn't have the right
privilege.
presence,
Yeah. So, but a lot of these, like you can say to that person, do you have diverse hiring policies in your firm? And they might say, of course we do. Like I'd like shudder at the thought that they wouldn't have. But when they're making a decision about something else, like can they hold, presence in a room, for example, there's all these unconscious things that they don't even know that's going on that's affecting their decision. And that's white privilege. So, and that's why when we talked about those examples before about the 97% of, white executives at TV stations or whatever, that's why that's actually has an effect in terms of the flow-on effects, in terms of the decisions they make, in terms of the decisions, and kind of hanging on to power in that way. And I think that's what you were speaking to when you were talking about the incumbents holding on to power and so on.
Yeah, and look, like there's a basic kind of we're social creatures, right? And like we're programmed to kind of have us, them, in-group, out-groups for our own protection back, in our tribal roots. We like people who are similar to us, who look the same as us, who cooperate. And so all these kind of things give us like elements of these biases, right? Look, I think let's move into some of the solutions, right? Perceived and our kind of view on how some of them are constructed. Because like I said before, this was the bit that was a little bit harder for me to grasp, especially from some of the mainstream texts out there, including the ones that we looked at. Like, can I start with a question for you, right? Without creating a model and all this kind of stuff, what do you think the advocates are wanting or asking from white people? Let's just start with white people in terms of a change of behavior.
Probably their first goal is for acknowledgement, right? And that would probably be a significant contributor to the solution, right? Is because you can't, if you don't recognize there's a problem or something exists, then how are you going to tackle it, right? So I think that's the first piece, right? And that's what a lot of these books are focused on, and kind of like again bringing out, and really drilling down though that it's the structural racism piece. It's not the obvious ones. It's not the
individual acts.
Yeah, it's not the white power and the people on the train who look at you funny. Those examples are kind of the easy stuff to deal with because they're so obvious. But it's actually to acknowledge the subtle stuff, right? The structural stuff that's the unconscious stuff, the whatever, right? And then I guess in terms of, well, what do you do to respond? I mean, I don't think they actually have like a clear designed, off the shelf solution to solve it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you, Andy. I think that the bulk of the effort is usually spent on getting the audience or getting us to a point of acknowledgement of the impact and our place in the structural elements of racism and privilege. In terms of behavior, I mean, there are other call outs where they were pretty much saying, it's your job to educate yourself in the same way that, like, like that example where like, if your doctor told you, you had a certain type of cancer, but then left the room, got called away to surgery, you wouldn't just be like, oh, I've got it, but no one's told me what it is. You go home and research it and understand how it's impacting you and others and all that kind of stuff. So I did like that. I think that's a good part too, becoming a bit more aware of what they are like, and not putting the onus always back on minorities to kind of tell their stories. Is actually, you show an interest and you educate yourself.
Yeah. The only thing is, we do have to be realistic. Like human behavior isn't to do that. Like people are self-interested. And in some ways it's a little bit like in our earlier episodes, we've talked about, for example, eating meat and like, yeah, it's bad to eat meat, but fuck it, I enjoy it. Like, so I'll eat it, right? Or we've talked about before, effective altruism and doing good things to try and get good outcomes. Like, but that sometimes it's not enough, right? Like knowing that you can do something really good to improve the outcome of someone else other than yourself, sometimes that's not enough. And that's the reality. And that's why some of these solutions, I think,
they're idealistic.
They're idealistic, and they're just not going to work, right? And this is why I think, just in thinking about the approach, like, so if we were kind of strategists for the white privilege sort of advocacy movement, I'd be saying something like, keep it a more open story, like, for people, or less confronting story for people, because if you hit with the hard edge, we're going to shock you into kind of,
we're going to hit those white woman tears pretty quick.
Well, what's going to happen is people will just see it as the elite sort of wokesters coming up with their extreme view of the world, and of course we don't want any of that at all. So go, and that's already happened with this stuff, right?
Let's talk about something that actually is happening all over the place in a lot of different industries, and that's diversity quotas. Yeah. So do you have a view on the impact of this, whether you support them or not?
Look, my instincts are they don't work. That's my instincts, because if you have fundamental structural disadvantages, then, and look, it depends on the context that we're talking about them, but often it gets one application it often gets raised in is say the university settings, right? We'll have sort of diversity quotas so that, people from different backgrounds can enter university courses or whatever. And one of the big criticisms of them in that context is that then you have people enter that don't have the other things that they need to succeed in that environment, or if people actually do possess what they need to succeed, in some ways it can actually re-entrench this notion that they're just there to make up the numbers and they're not taken seriously. And it almost
affirmative action,
kind of doubles down. That said, I do think if you can kind of address things at the lower levels and the layers, I think it's kind of one of those things that it's not a black and white sort of thing. So I do think there's some applications where they could work quite effectively. So, for example, I think about, say, diversity quotas in the context of is it a wise move for political parties to be more representative to the electorate? And I think tactically it is, because if you want to attract voters, you should project an image that you reflect the electorate. And invariably, political parties are kind of not that diverse. And so then I kind of think, well, strategically, does it actually make sense in some of those things to have quotas? Well, perhaps it does, but it just depends on the context and the application. But yeah, I don't have a black and white yes or no. It's good or bad. I think it can be used, but maybe not in all settings.
Yeah.
That's my I'm on the fence answer.
You're in the middle.
I'm in the middle.
Yeah, it's kind of I do agree. I suppose it's where I feel it's where the incumbent kind of biases are centralized. If it's much further back in the pipe and there are barriers to entry even to feeder kind of populations, education, and so on, then that's not going to help.
I guess one of the other aspects here, more generally, is what does the end state actually look like? So is the end state that, the color of your skin and your the visual cues of your racial makeup, to the extent that I know we've talked about race being a social construct, but the way you look and the way that these sorts of things and your background might kind of signal your otherness, so to speak, is the solution that we eliminate that, and is the end state that the way you look and that is as unremarkable as the color of your hair, or in a way such that everyone's considered as white, if you like, so everyone is white, so social constructs style, so everyone's part of the single group that we call white, no matter what you look like or your background or anything like that, or is it something different to that?
This is something that I've been pondering, right? Stepping back as just two normal guys, what is the use of all this shit, right? By talking it, by giving it more airtime, are we making the problem better through awareness or worse because it's more divisive, right? And if we are trying to get to a place of race being a kind of maybe a homogenous but an unremarkable aspect of the human condition, right? And how we're treated. I sent you that little clip of Morgan Freeman being interviewed where he's against Black History Month and he's being asked, what do we do about racism? And he just says, stop fucking talking about it. I'm not, you don't think of me as a black man. You just say, Morgan, I treat you as an individual, blah, blah, blah. And I've been thinking about that, right? And I think that this whole like colorblind thing, right? I understand why it's a seductive endpoint, because in its purest form, in its ideal, and you genuinely don't think it's remarkable, I think that that is a good target state, but it's idealistic. It's not, like I don't think we will ever get to that spot. And I think by doing that, you're essentially muting the problem. If you can't notice race and celebrate differences, and also not celebrate, but identify prejudice, then you're not really going to ever make the changes necessary to adapt to that. So I do think that I like the ideal, but I do wonder, and especially how convenient that Morgan Freeman, a minority that has succeeded in that sphere by a whole bunch of his own work and other factors, doesn't want to talk about race anymore.
I mean, I think you say it doesn't work or it's idealistic, but I guess I'll disagree on that in the sense that there might be new groups that are considered others, right, for whatever reason. But we have very clear examples where people of a certain background were once considered others that are now not considered others. So if we think of groups like Italians in countries like Australia and America and so on, I think would now be, and I don't want to speak on behalf of those groups. I'm not, that's not my role, but my sense is that, now they're largely considered white, right? Part of the white dominant culture. Equally, Irish Catholics, for example, that do have quite a history of being treated as a sort of an out group or whatever. But these are groups now that don't face that. At least maybe they don't face it to anywhere near the extent that they did in the past. And to be honest with you, I think most people would sort of conceive of them within the white world now, right?
Yeah.
And so
the Anglosphere,
whatever word language we want to use when we're talking about the social construct.
I understand what you mean. I guess I'm separating this idea of not race being unremarkable, which I think it's not that, right? Like I don't think that an end state for people of Asian heritage or even Irish heritage and other things like that you mentioned, that their race is unremarkable because they would want to protect their customs and celebrate. Assimilation is a problematic thing in a way, right? Because when you say you see us like that, that's like an acceptance piece, but it's not. What it can be misconstrued with is an erasing or a minimizing of the cultural experience or some of the richness of your culture that you want to still uphold.
I guess this is where it gets really tricky though, right? Because for me, if you asked me when I was growing up, why is racism bad? I would say something like, because it's unfair for people who have no control over the way they look and their background or whatever. And, and they get disadvantaged, whatever. But when we talk about culture, what if the culture is something that contributes to success? So, for example, what if liberal Western values contributes to success of a society and we want to maintain those values and those cultural traits? What if we're talking about the fact that some societies, watch the clock and run to time in, more religiously than others? What if that's a feature of success?
I thought you said Italians were in.
So it gets very complicated very quickly.
It does. And going back to it, right, I agree with the ideal, right? But I don't think the right way to get there is in the short term is being kind of colorblind, pretending like you don't see that dark skin. Well,
especially when you're not.
Or, it's like that kind of adage, I don't see race or whatever. I think that is not spending enough care or being close enough to the situation to kind of work out what to do, right? And I do also think that in the same way that to assimilate to values and work as part of the Australian society, you don't need to throw away all your cultural heritage. In the same way that we have a bustling, food scene for Italians, Greeks, and Asian cultures and stuff. There's a way to do it. It just needs to be carefully tracked.
Yeah, but to be fair, I think that's something that we have done quite well in Australia. And I think for anyone who would say Australia's got a racism problem or whatever, I think when you actually think about the core of what Australia has built, we have built a society where people the modern Australia, and there might be lots of legacies and historical issues and challenges, but the modern Australia has allowed enough room for different people of different backgrounds to maintain a connection to those things whilst also showing up to work and being accepted.
So, Andy, after spending the week and reading the books that we have, what would you say is kind of, your take on it all?
I think it was good to be exposed not just to like the theoretical side of the discussion around white privilege and all the associated discussion around race and so on, but to actually kind of hear some of the meat on the bone, like the stories, because as someone who probably hasn't directly had to deal with race, it does get very theoretical. And, I think like when you're discussing these issues, the white person's like default is to like, let's get a chart out and try and like, analyze it and decompose everything into like all of its component parts. And, I think there's a place for that. And I think certainly that's, in some ways, that's actually the kind of the man from Mars sort of view from Mars sort of approach. But at the same time, some of these issues are quite personal, and maybe that's not the right approach in all circumstances. And it was good to hear some of the stories and give a bit more, I was going to say color to the experience, but that's give a bit more depth.
No, I think you're right, actually. This is one of those topics where how you have the conversation is almost more important than kind of where you land, right? And that's what makes it really tricky. I think that there is a part of me that I think when you start to think about your sponsorship or your advocacy of a certain group and the principles they uphold, it does start to get tricky, and your mind starts to morph in a conversation. And it's like, am I saying this as a person, as an individual, or am I actually saying it because I identify with this group? And I think the books have a way of putting you into that mindset and giving you a language to bring up things that have, and the connotations that they bring to the table are far-reaching. So I'm still trying to unpack it all, to be honest. Like it's kind of hard for me to understand, I suppose, the benefits of introducing these new concepts to this discussion compared to our earlier discussion, because it's a secondary thing now. You have to not only unpack those concepts and see whether you agree with them before you start using them, but then perhaps it's not your voice as an individual anymore, and you're not reflecting on your personal experience and your kind of understanding of the issue.
Okay, well, on that note, do you think we've solved all these issues to do with race?
No, I think actually Michael Jackson did that in that film clip, Black or White, where he, like, at the end there was the white baby and the black baby on top of the world. I think that was pinnacle. So Andy, the only relevant question is that this week we read 2 books on white privilege, one written by a black author and one written by a white author. Which one did you prefer?
They were both equally wonderful.
Big believer in equality, I can see. To be real, the white person did do it better.